Welcome to the Marvel Mindset, a podcast from ex-Marvel CEO Peter Cuneo. Listen as Peter shares inside stories of what it took to turn around Marvel. Here's your host, Peter Cuneo.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Peter Cuneo. I'm the host of the Marvel Mindset. This is our series of short episodes that we're releasing every Monday morning, talking about the history of Marvel, and most importantly, how Marvel came out of bankruptcy and 10 years later sold to the Walt Disney Company for $4.5 billion. How did we actually pull that off? And today, as we continue to review strategic decisions that Marvel made that led to great success, we're going to focus on absolutely perhaps the most important one, even more important than our movement into motion pictures. And that is to redo, if you will, our comic book publishing organization and how we thought about comic books and so on. There are a number of changes that were made that were very, very important to our success. Have to remember, in a company like Marvel, basically, your comic book business is, I'm going to call it the fountain of youth. This is where all your great characters come from. And yeah, they can make great movies and do great licensing business and so on. But without the comic book entity, without those writers, those publishers, those illustrators, those editors, Marvel is nothing. So it was very important to go right back to basics and look at what was going on in comic books. So when we did look at the comic book business, I had mentioned previously that during the bankruptcy, we definitely had a lot of talent leave the company, talent in the comic book world, because there was so much uncertainty about Marvel's future. So, of course, as I've also said, the first order of business was to attract, where we could, that talent back to Marvel. And that did start, but it took several years, actually, to complete what we wanted to do in terms of bringing talent back to the company and chasing some of the best new talent in the industry as well. One of the things that we all thought was that because of the bankruptcy and so on, the quality of our books was average. Now, I have to be honest, I'm a person who hates the word average, particularly in business. I wish we should always ascribe to and strive to be better than average and great if at all possible. But I really don't like the word average at all. So we made several changes in how we thought about the business. The first I've mentioned in a previous episode, and that was this. When we looked at attracting new fans to the comic book world and therefore to the Marvel world, one of the problems is a lot of potential new fans were frustrated because if they wanted to follow a specific character, they had to start on, for example, issue 222 of Spider-Man or 150 of Hulk or whatever. And they were missing out completely on the most important part, I think, for me at least, of the characters, which is their origin story. What were they like growing up? How did they get their powers? What are they good at? What are their failings? All of that, the knowledge of that is absolutely a precursor to really getting into the characters and really being excited about them. So we started to retell the Marvel character stories from the beginning with a line called Marvel Ultimates. I actually showed one of the Ultimates in a previous episode, what the comic book for Spider-Man looked like, but basically starting from the beginning. How did these characters, taking Spider-Man, how did Spider-Man get started? How did Peter Parker get his powers and what have you? And bring certain things up, up to date. Remember this, Spider-Man came on the scene in 1961. And here we are now in the early 2000s retelling the story. And so there were some differences, but no major changes. That was very, very important. I learned the hard way, never change the origin story for a character. We also thought that these story arcs that we were, if you will, the chapters in the comic books for a character were too long. You would have to go through months of buying the comic books to get to the end of that particular chapter in that particular adventure for a character. And so we decided to shorten the story arcs to 4 to 6 weeks. So in a period of 4 to 6 weeks, the buyer of the comic book for their favorite character, for example, could live a complete adventure with that character rather than having to go months and months and months on end to learn what actually happened, what the finality was. There were also a lot of new businesses that we could expand our comic book world into. Certainly trade paperbacks and graphic novels were a growing entity in that business. I personally love the graphic novels because you're getting a whole series of comic books either collected and put into a book, effectively a book, a softcover book, or you're getting a whole new adventure, sometimes all new characters in what we call the graphic novel. And many of the successful comic book-like films that were made over the years and are still being made in Hollywood came from original graphic novels. Very big source. If you think about it, they're almost like a script. And in many cases, in our types of films, fantasy films, it's very common for the director, for example, to actually have a comic book artist draw a comic book that shows it's more than a comic book, a couple of comic books in length that actually shows as the film as they want to make it. It's a very helpful tool that movie makers have. And there were other outlets for comic books which were not traditional. Bookstores, for example, convenience stores. Can you go into a 7-Eleven and get one of our comic books? The answer was, in some cases, yes. Also, mass merchants were very interested, again, in stocking and displaying comic books. So a lot of more increased exposure for comic books. When I went to Marvel originally, there were about 3,000 comic book shops that were certainly the center point for buying comic books and collecting and what have you. But now there were all these other distribution areas that could also be very popular and help us expand the comic book world and therefore expand Marvel's world. And we went into all of them very aggressively. And then finally, I think the other change, if you will, that was very, very important and corresponds with the strategic decision to focus very heavily on cash and so on, is that we decided that we'd no longer publish or rather print our own books. We would leave that to distributors around the world to actually do the printing and to do the distribution to comic book shops and other outlets, so that we didn't really have an investment financially in the books themselves. Again, another way to conserve cash, which I think was very, very important and frankly made our lives much simpler. Let the complexities of distribution be done by other people. We'll break for a moment, then continue the story. Those are some of the changes that we made in the world of our comic book publishing. I think they all were very important. And when you think about them collectively, all those changes, it's really, really important because collectively that was a boulder in our pond, so to speak, if you've heard me talk about that in previous episodes. It was a big, big, important change collectively. One of the other new areas that we wanted to attack strategically was the video game business. Obviously, the demographic, the type of person who was interested in comic books would be interested in video games and vice versa. If one looked at who was participating in the comic book world at the time, what the normal person looked like, and in video games, they were one and the same. So we wanted definitely to start doing video games for our characters. And the first decision we made in that area was to do a deal with Activision. We did that deal about 3 months after I became CEO. And that deal was for a number of our A-list characters. And it was, a very, very important, if you will, start to our video game business. But we also considered working or did work with a number of other very well-known producers of video games. I'm talking about THQ. Microsoft was in the business. Electronic Arts, of course, was the leader at the time. Take-Two and Sega, all were people that we either worked with or certainly had, important conversations with. And video gaming today is still very big, although it's certainly morphed into esports and a lot of other activities. But if anything, that market has grown astronomically. And I'm sure, Mark, that the basis that we set way back then for that industry, or that type of media form, was very, very important to Marvel's future. And another key strategic decision that we made was to focus very heavily on the toy business. And in fact, when Marvel came out of bankruptcy, we actually were in the toy business. We actually had manufacturing facilities, and we would make our own toys and selling them. And in 2001, once again, to make our business simplified, we actually licensed out the toy business, a very, very important change to people that could make the products, people we knew very well, so we knew we'd get quality, but also sell the products around the world on a global basis. And the toys were very important, particularly to be co-promoted with our films. Action figures were the biggest subcategory of toys. And of course, that was a perfect category for Marvel and so on and so forth. I really enjoyed a lot of the creativity that we came up with in the toy business. One of the things I remember is a product called Hulk Hands, for those of you that have been around quite a while. Our first Hulk movie was, I believe, in 2002. And a fellow who worked in the company called Alan Fine came up with this idea of Hulk Hands, which were literally big green hands that you put your hands inside of and could do things with. And they were one of the hottest selling toys we ever had. And one day I was looking at television and watching some of the debate in the U.S. Congress, and I almost fell out of my chair when I saw that I think it was a senator who was addressing Congress and was very adamant, vehement, emotional about a certain subject, was actually wearing Hulk Hands and pounding on the podium. And I thought to myself, wow, we've really come a long way in the toy business. Another reason that we never made R-rated films when I was with Marvel, not with the major characters anyway, is because there would be no toy business with R-rated. A big retailer like a Walmart would be a very good example, would never put toys on its shelves to sell from an R-rated movie. It just wasn't going to happen. So my philosophy, my policy was no R-rated movies that were major characters. There's some minor characters we experimented with, but they were never going to have a toy line anyway. But basically, all of the big characters, all those movies that that we brought out then, that all had big toy support, but none of them were R-rated. We also had a lot of fun with our toy business in making the toys very giftable, particularly around Christmas or around Halloween with our licensed costumes and so on. Gift giving became very important to us, and we spent a lot of time making sure that retailers were promoting the products around those seasons. That also worked very well for us, whether we had a film debuting or not. It was, again, very successful. Well, that's it for today. Talking about some more key decisions. We'll be back in the next episode to continue on with these key decisions that Marvel made that were very, very important for our ultimate success. Hope you're enjoying what we're about. And my name is Peter Cuneo, and I'm hoping to see you back here again next Monday. Thank you so much.